Hi everyone, today I want to talk about uniques and which of those are still going to be relevant in Season 4. So I've been working on a lot of build guides lately, or build planners at least, and here's for example the list of planners that I have been theory crafting on in like the last week or so in preparation for Season 4. So I've done some builds for every class, kind of mostly the best builds and some of the builds I would like to play. This is not a full comprehensive list of builds you can make, of course, but I do have a bunch of them for everyone. And I just saw the patterns a little bit of what is going to go down in the next season, now that I have like a pretty good overview of all of the classes. So I actually opened all of those planners that you just saw there from my Discord channel, and I'm just gonna go through them a little bit to show you how many uniques we actually have. And it turns out it's not that many. I guess a lot of people were expecting this already. With the tempering changes and the itemization changes, Blizzard has not really updated the existing uniques almost at all. There are a few things like the razor blade or something that has been redesigned slightly, but in the grand scheme of things, not really anything has changed on the uniques. And this means that they've kind of just lost a lot of power compared to other items. There's also, for example, some items like the Tybalt's Will. Tybalt's Will was a very powerful item for getting resources, right? We have this up here in our unique tier list, for example, for Season 3. A lot of builds use this item. It gives you damage, it gives you damage reduction, it gives you resources, and it's kind of like a really easy way to solve resources on a lot of builds. But for example, resources is just like not an issue anymore for anyone really. So this effect has kind of just like lost a lot of its value for most builds. And also it also got nerfed a little bit. The damage is only 20 now instead of 40. However, there's another interesting development on those uniques, which is that some uniques have damage reduction, like this one actually. And this actually gives it back some of its lost value, I guess, because damage reduction no longer exists at all. The only item that can still roll damage reduction is a shield on a necromancer, and almost no one really wants to run with a shield, I guess. So that leaves us with only those uniques actually having any kind of damage reduction, unless you actually put a defensive aspects on those pants, for example. But there are also, for example, some boots. There's like Flicker Step that has damage reduction. If you look at that here. So this thing is a pair of boots where you cannot put a defensive aspect, but you can get a juicy chunk of damage reduction. And not just that, this can be a greater affix and it can be masterworked. So in the end, you can have something like 30% DR or from close or something like that on a pair of boots, which is actually pretty nutty in the new world of Season 4, basically. So there are some considerations like that here as well that are pretty interesting for making builds, but ultimately most of these items lost a lot of value. There are still some pretty good uniques out there that basically make their way into every build, depending on the class. Some of those are class specific, for example the Tarasha loop. That one is still a really powerful item because it just has decent stats and it has a really strong effect. And you can even get 4 stacks of this now relatively easily with Mental Surge triggers, for example, if you want to put that on your build, at least if you don't want to put anything better as a temper mod on your weapon. You can actually get more value than normal out of this ring here. Or, for example, for the Necros, we have the Ring of Sacrilegious Soul. Again, this is also kind of like a staple in many builds, just because of the insane quality of life that it brings. However, it's also not necessarily required anymore. This was usually a very good item that also just was part of your resource recovery engine, because you just got corpse explosions everywhere all the time, giving you resources from your passives. And again, as I mentioned, resources are not a problem anymore. Everyone has infinite amount of resources basically, with essence per second rolls on your helm or your chest or something like that. And just generally the game has kind of just power crept a lot, so that stuff like that is just kind of falling off a bit. And then there comes the question of the Uber uniques. So that is an interesting one, because Uber uniques are actually still quite powerful. They were generally just like designed to be much more powerful than other regular uniques, maybe outside of Andariel's, which is pretty down bad now. But ultimately, those Uber uniques can still be used in a lot of builds. So we have the Harlequin Crest here, for example. That is still +4 skill ranks and 20% damage reduction. That's a pretty good item. It has good stats still, like life is good, cooldown is good, resource depending on the build. All stats kind of whatever, I guess. But it also depends a little bit. There are some builds that really want to have, for example, a specific skill roll on the helm. And the thing is that skill ranks are generally just kind of like not as powerful as before anymore, because you get a lot more of them. I'm gonna show you an example. Here's Twisting Blades Rogue. So you can get plus 10 ranks to a skill now if you really try. And this works for all of the other skills as well, not just the poison imbuement. So every class, core skills, anything can have 10 ranks now. And this means that adding extra ranks from the Shaco, for example, is not really that powerful. And it also means that if you have a build like this one, where you actually have an important skill to put on the helm, you would never really consider a Shaco to be worthwhile. But it's still a good item just to like boost the damage a bit further. It's just like less impactful than before. Previously you got like plus 6 ranks or something maybe on a skill or something, and now you get like plus 10. That's quite a difference. But especially if you care about the resources as well, Harlequin Crest can be quite nice, because resource generation is not something that you just put on your rings anymore these days. It doesn't exist as a regular stat anymore. It can only be tempered on rings, but usually there's just better options. So resource generation in general is kind of like a rare thing, and if that is important for you, then Harlequin Crest actually remains a relatively decent option. Then we also have some other really powerful Uber uniques. Star Disguise, just the effect alone is so powerful, even with resources not really being an issue anymore in 2024. There are some builds that are so resource hungry that they actually want to have, for example, a juicy two-handed resource cost reduction roll. For example, I have this here on the Death Trap build. I'm gonna show this off real quick. So you can get a lot of resource cost reduction here on two-handed weapons now for everyone, plus all of this resource recovery you can get from like other rolls. So it's not really hard to manage the resources, but some builds are just so resource hungry that they actually want to do both. So I have a setup like this here. We have 60% resource cost reduction and a Stardust Sky for 40% resource cost reduction, just to make sure that our barrage in this case basically costs nothing, because we spam it like 3 times a second, and it's kind of hard to sustain that. So there are some of those cases where Stardust Skies will still pop off really hard, and of course it also gives you 40% damage. While the stats are kind of whatever, the effect makes up for it. And it has this double always roll, which is great. So Stardust Skies is still remaining pretty good. I'd say Grandfather, especially for the barbs, is remaining one of the top choices. The other class I can use it as a Necro, which may or may not use it in maybe a build or two, but I don't really believe in that very much. For the barbs, it's just double damage on crits, and it's very easy to get a lot of crit chance these days. So this is a very powerful item actually, for the barbs in particular. And then we have other Uber uniques here that are just kind of like worse. So I mentioned Andariel's. So this is down here. It's probably going to go down even further, to be honest. Andariel's has never really been the meta for anything. It's just kind of there, and that's it. There's Ahavarion. I talked about this in another video specifically. This might be like a really strong kind of cheese item for Sorcs and Druids, depending on how hard the pit gets in the end. If the pit is kind of like unbeatable, then you can use Ahavarion to cheese your way to victory, basically, by one-shotting everything with Blast Wave Shrines and Conduit Shrines and Artillery Shrines. But that remains to be seen. Other than that, yeah, it's a kind of fun item or so, but nothing super crazy. And there's also the new Uber unique, the Tyrael's Might. So that one is also a relatively good item, I gotta say. We have this here, and it has this really powerful mod, maximum resistance to all elements. And it also has damage reduction on top of that. The effect itself is almost completely irrelevant. It may do a little bit of damage in like open world content, but it does very little. So it's not really supposed to do much, I guess. But the item itself is very strong defensively, especially if you start masterworking this maximum rest to all elements. Because adding maximum resistances is extremely powerful, especially because you can eventually cap out. You can go from 70% to almost 85% with this, which basically means you only take half the damage. It's like the equivalent of like a 50%, or I don't know, maybe 40-45% damage reduction roll. So if you like masterwork this, and then you get the greater affix, and right now the planner doesn't support the masterworking crits, but that's gonna get fixed. You can get, I think, 13.5% maximum resistance to all elements, which gives you nearly this cap and nearly 50% damage reduction effectively. So in those cases, Tyrael's Might can be pretty powerful as a defensive option, and kind of like replace another like defensive aspects in the chest and more, basically. But it doesn't really have anything else to go for it. And there's the Doombringer here. So this is still like a really powerful item, in particular for the rogues, I guess. I don't think you'd really want to use this on an Necro unless you're really desperate. And barbs are just kind of like invincible tanks, I would say. They don't really need it, especially if they have stuff like the Grandfather as well or something. You probably want to go with like a real weapon to temper it. But on the rogue, I think this is a good option because rogues are just kind of squishy and it gives you a lot of survivability. This used to be very good in Abattoir Z already for the rogues, just to be able to survive those higher tiers. And it might be similar in the pit again. So I'm kind of like banking on this one, at least for rogues as well. And as Path of Exile, I mean, probably pretty good item, but it also just doesn't really bring enough power. Amulets are extremely powerful item slots, and using Path of Exile will almost always mean a damage loss of something like a third or more or something for your build, because you're just missing that huge offensive power on your amulet and probably like some passive that is important. Like for some classes like druids, not having envenom on your amulet, for example, that basically means that the item is unusable. So that would probably still hold true here. But ultimately, if you want to be really, really tanky at all costs, then this is still a pretty good item. So for stuff like, you know, cheesing Uberlitive or so, this was always a good thing, or in PvP, these kind of things. But ultimately, I don't really expect that much of this item. And that covers most of these Uber uniques here and other uniques that are still going to be relevant. I didn't talk about Tempest Raw, so Tempest Raw is just kind of like a requirement for many Druid builds, so you want to have this because it just enables so many scaling options. So, you know, basically all of the good Druid builds will still go for Tempest Raw. However, keep in mind you can trade uniques now. You cannot trade Ubers, but you can trade normal uniques. So it's much, much easier to actually get your builds online if you have friends that find it, or if you just, you know, go and trade and see if you can get it there. And it's not just going to be that hard to get it anymore. In general, also boss materials drop a lot more, so getting the right unique that you need is just like much more accessible. You get a lot more uniques on those bosses, they're way easier to farm, so there's that. But ultimately what this means is that most of these uniques that we have on the list are actually just kind of like going down into F tier, into the trash. And there might be like kind of good items early on, like let's say you are level 70, just entered World Tier 4, you don't even have temper recipes yet that you want. Yeah, if you find something like a Penitent Greaves, that could be nice or something, but it's not something that you're really gonna hold on to, because there are just like so many replacements on your gear now as just affixes. And I'm gonna show you another example here. We can go on the rogue again, for example. Like Penitent Grief used to be a really good item for rogues, but now it's just kind of like pointless, because you have stuff like chance to freeze, chance to stun, chance to daze, and you can just put this on all of your gear basically. You don't need stuff like Penitent Greaves to really get these kind of effects anymore. You don't need an Azure Wrath to get freeze on the barb or on the rogue or something like that. You just put it on one temper slot on your chest or something, and that's it. So some of these uniques just have lost their entire reason to exist in that sense, because what made them unique is not really special anymore. So they kind of just go down, and the particular weapons have really powerful temper mods that are sometimes even build enabling, or, you know, just really strong, like for example here, chance to cast twice mods and these kind of things. These are direct damage multipliers that most uniques just cannot make up for. So unless you really need a specific unique for a build to function, for example the new Fractured Winterglass for Frozen Orb, we have that here. If you look at this here, this is like, you know, a build enabling item. It's like you need this item in order to play the end game version of this build. Or the same with the Firebolt. We have the new Flameweaver gloves. It's the same story here. You need this item in order to play a Firebolt build. So of course you're going to use those unique items, but you see here there's not really that much else most of the time. So we have this item that makes the build. Then we have Tarashas, for example, on a Sork. As I mentioned, is a pretty powerful item still. You're going to throw that in there if you have it. Otherwise, doesn't matter too much. And that's it. And if you look at all these other builds now that I've made, you're going to see the same pattern. Everything that doesn't have a build-defining item basically doesn't run uniques anymore. Maybe you're going to throw in an Uber unique. So I mentioned, for example, on Barbs, the Grandfather is really good. Maybe a Shaco here and there. And maybe some of the others as well. I didn't actually make like the Uber unique planners for all of these builds just yet. These are just the standard versions basically without Ubers. But you see here, there is nothing here. In this barb, this is a double swing barb, so we use a double swing glove, of course, and that's it. Then we have another one. You see there is nothing here on, for example, the Thorn spot besides the Razor Plate. Again, kind of the same story. Then we have Druids. Druids generally a lot of uniques, as I mentioned. Tempest Raw, Hunter's Zenith, also a really strong item this season, together with the Wild Heart Hunger, new boots here. For Druids in general, there is actually a bunch of stuff like this because of the shapeshifting stuff that is just so powerful for the top builds for Druids. You want to do constant shapeshifting all the time. If you don't like this playstyle very much, tough luck, to be honest, because that is a really powerful combo. And you're gonna notice the loss in damage if you don't want to play around this very much. So this is just how Druid works in Season 4, I'd say. You have to shapeshift, and you have to go and play around Hunter's Zenith and these kind of things. And kind of same story here, there's a Hurricane build, Hunter's Zenith, Tempest Raw. Then we have Lightning Storm, kind of the same story. Then we have, this is Companion Druid. Well, there's another built-in enemy item. There's a Wild Heart Hunger, okay. But you see here again, it's mostly just like these one or two kind of like really good class-specific items. Again, here's a Sacrilegious Soul, for example, on the Necro. Same story here on this Necro build. This is Bone Spear Skellies. And yeah, if you don't have any of those skill-specific uniques, you just don't really run uniques. That's just how it is. So here again, there's a Rogue Rapid Fire build. There's Scoundrel's Kiss. There's the Rapid Fire unique. You're going to use that. That's it. And so on. So basically all these builds don't really run uniques. That's kind of like how Season 4 is going to go. So it's a pretty interesting shift in how the game works, I gotta say, because previously, like a lot of these uniques were just so powerful that you just threw all of them into your build. Like, you know, almost everyone had a Tibbot's Will. You know, every Sork had Tarasha's Ring. Everyone wanted their Shaco. You know, everyone wanted a Grandfather, and so on. So yeah, now you just don't really do that anymore, basically. You don't necessarily throw every single Uber unique into your build that you have. You don't necessarily throw all of the other good uniques in there if you have them, because the stats on your items are just so impactful and you can get so much good stuff. And it's also just like easier, I guess, to farm like a good pair of pants that has like maybe 2 or even 3 greater affixes of the stuff that you want, versus trying to get, for example, a Tibbot's Will that has 2 or 3 greater affixes, which, you know, then might also hit stuff that you don't care about, like potion capacity or something like that. So in that case, yeah, some of these uniques also just don't scale as well necessarily. Maybe they have like this one really good stat, like here, this close damage that I mentioned. If you hit that with a greater affix and then start masterworking it, yeah, suddenly this is definitely quite impactful. But most of the other uniques don't necessarily have like a really powerful, like shiny stat, basically. They might just be kind of like alright and have like an alright effect, but alright just doesn't really cut it. Which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because of how much this season actually focuses on improving the bossing experience. Like they introduced the Tormentor bosses, and they introduced the you know, extra boss materials that drop everywhere now, and you just get a lot more of them. It's way easier to actually get your builds online with uniques that you want and go farm those bosses, and you have to do less of it for more loot with the tormented versions of them. And it turns out we don't really want much of the loot anymore. So you don't really want that many Uber uniques. You already get 3 resplendent sparks just from playing the game, from the season journey and some other sources. And well, then you can maybe get one more and, you know, salvage it if it's not the right one, and craft whatever Uber unique one for a build, and that's probably about it actually. And this is how you gear up, and the rest will actually just be mostly farming those legendary items, getting the right aspects, getting the right tempers, getting the greater affixes, and this is how you're gonna gear up mostly. I heard a lot of voices from the PTR that saw this coming already. Obviously this is just an expected development, I guess, with like uniques losing value compared to legendaries, and a lot of people thought that this is a problem. Personally, I don't really think it's a huge problem. I guess there could be, you know, some sort of maybe system or overhaul of uniques that brings them up again a little bit, but Blizzard has specifically said they want uniques to be, it's just kind of like they drop and they are done. You know, this is the item basically, and you can just equip it and you know what you got. So that's kind of the vibe that I got there, at least. And this means that we're probably not going to see a lot of like crafting options like tempering on these uniques in the future, but the devs have said that they are looking into ways to update uniques in some way to maybe give them some kind of progression path or some extra value or something like that, to bring them up a little bit across the board. To be honest, personally, I actually like the new system right now. I actually like that we don't have that many uniques, and you kind of think about which one you want to put into your build. I like this a lot more than just, okay, I have like those 5 uniques, I stick them into every single build and that's it. And then I have like only like 4 slots left on my setup or something if I'm playing a druid with a 2-handed weapon, for example. Like this here. Like if I have like 5 uniques, then there's not really much else left in this build to even, you know, have any kind of like, you know, room for extra aspects, for some, you know, special combos or something like that. So I really like having more legendary items and less uniques. And those uniques being like really like a conscious decision and much more impactful for when it really matters. Either way, that's just my personal opinion. I just mostly wanted to show you guys what it's going to be like in the next season. So TLDR, a lot less uniques. Some of those, especially class-specific uniques, are still very valuable. And of course, all of the skill-specific uniques are basically a requirement. So whenever you play a certain build and that build has a unique, you know, Firebolt, Frozen Orb, you know, all this kind of stuff, you want to use that unique, basically. This is kind of like the final step to unlock. But other than that, yeah, not really many uniques anymore, including Uber uniques. So you might use 1 or 2 Uber uniques here and there, depending on the build, and that's about it. And that concludes this video as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope that this helps you like plan your builds out for the next season and plan your general like progression strategy. Personally, I'm quite excited for the season, so let's see how it will go. Hope you liked this video, and see you guys next time.